Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our another panel in this 2021 PISA conference. The title of panel session 5 is the economic and social costs of living in the age of Anthropocene. This COVID-19 crisis exacerbates further the development of the already vulnerable economies as they face economic and financial crisis due to this global health crisis. Though countries have already adopted measures to protect their borders and the spread of the COVID-19, existing external factors continue to persist along the areas of peace and security, international trade and investment, global economic growth, and even human migration. So this panel is comprised of diverse topics along the spectrums of international and global cooperation and economic and social development. Specifically, it will talk about the development issues of global poverty, food insecurity, inequalities among states, realities of migration, and the devastating impacts of terrorism. My name is Mel Reyes, and joining me in this panel are my colleagues from the Department of International Studies and from PISO. So we have 4 very interesting presentations for this morning. We will first present all the papers, and after all the presentations, we will have our open forum. But during the presentation, if you already have some questions in mind or comments, you are free to type in the chat box so we can consolidate everything later on. Without further ado, let us now begin the presentation with our first topic, the comic mind and global poverty in Anthropocene's tragic imaginary, to be presented by Ms. Lorna Israel. Ms. Lorna has a BA in International Studies from Miriam College, Maryknoll College, and an MA in Philippine Studies from the Asian Center University of the Philippines, where she is currently pursuing a PhD on Philippine Studies with Foreign Relations as her area of specialization. So Lawrence, you may now start your presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Mel, and I'd like to acknowledge my fellow panelists for this morning session. I will share my PowerPoint, and I might exceed the 10-minute time allotment, but I'll try to make it faster, right? So thank you, and welcome to this session, everybody. So can everybody see the presentation?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay, wait lang. So it is all right, no? Okay, so basically the title speaks for itself, the comic mind and global poverty in Anthropocene's tragic imaginary, and later on I will try to unpack each of the terms in that title rather than reading out to you aloud my abstract. And perhaps for this, I'd like to...
Lawrence, excuse me for a while. Can you slides, show slide so that it can
slide.
be bigger?
Okay, wait lang.
So it can be a little bigger for slideshow. It's at the lower right yata ito.
Wait lang. Maybe I can ask na lang the technical to present my slide. I can't seem to find it. I'll just make some control on my part. Sorry. Pwede namang ako yung mag-click, di ba? No.
I think no, if they'll be the one to present it. No. I think okay lang din. It's okay, Lawrence. You can share your screen, probably just make it a little bigger. We can read naman if we cannot see the slideshow.
Oh. Okay. Stop sharing na lang siguro.
Yeah, can we let yan?
Sorry about this. Is this big enough? Hello?
Yeah, can you make it a little bigger? Lawrence, meron dun slideshow. Can you click the slideshow? Yung sa
Saan yung
slideshow?
slideshow?
Sa taas.
Sa taas?
Yeah.
Okay.
Beside
There.
animation. Yeah.
All
That's
right.
it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you for the technical assistance. I'd like to begin this presentation with a short video clip called Welcome to Anthropocene, which was presented at the opening conference of the 2012 Rio Summit on Sustainable Development. And as you watch the video, I hope you can detect the paradox or the irony, because from that irony or paradox, we can originate or we can detect where humor is. Does it have a sound?
There's no sound.
There.
Still no sound. Yes.
May sound na?
Wala pa rin. Wala pang sound. Can you try to remove your headset?
My headset?
I-unplug mo dun sa computer. Let's see if... Ay, wala pa rin pala. Yeah. Lawrence, wala pa rin sound. There's no sound. Sorry, wait. Lawrence, there's no sound. We can't hear anything.
No sound?
Wala.
Sound? Okay, it's okay. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
so I'll just briefly, actually the video is available on YouTube. I'll just briefly tell what it's all about. It talks about how for the first time in the history of humanity or mankind, never has the world have so much achieved, no, because of the many medical and technological invention. But at the same time, the world or the global system is at risk because of the loss of biodiversity, the hole in the ozone layer, etc. So there is that. Why is that? You know, we have so much, but at the same time, the Earth system, which supports our having so muchness, is at risk. And at that conference, there were two kinds of minds that were observed by one observer during that the proceeding of the conference. The number one was the UN Secretary General at the time was Ban Ki-moon, and he considered the conference a success. But the NGOs or the civil societies considered, they were disappointed because they think that it was out of touch with reality because there was no mention of planetary boundaries, tipping points, or carrying capacity. So basically, the Anthropocene's tragic question was, why the poor? Because the conference basically upheld poverty eradication as the overarching goal of the sustainable development. So why the poor? Why not the planet's impending annihilation as the video projected it? Well, in principle, the poor exist in an abundance. of knowing how to end it and money committed to ending poverty. Poverty actually is a trillion bankable propositions if only minds could be framed to expend more for the poor. So at some point in the 1990s, the IMF World Bank released a paper from billions to trillions, transforming development assistance, because they wanted to convert the billion investment for the MDG, or the Millennium Development Goal, and which eventually became the SDG, or this Sustainable Development Goal. And the SDG is to frame the mind of those who wanted to eradicate poverty might be increased to 1 trillion. So how can one refuse poverty when trillions are being committed to ensure its ending? Kofi Annan, hailed by Amartya as an articulate and insightful champion of the world's poor and dispossessed, but how rude of the poor if they became wealthy. That would be like stripping Sen of his championship. In Development as Freedom, Sen recounts a story of a husband and wife having a conversation about wealth, poverty, and immortality. The wife's question was, what should I do with that by which I do not become immortal? The wife's question was, if I became wealthy, would I become immortal? And Sen's response to the wife's question, the issue is not to live forever, but to have the capability to live really long. And he regarded the question as part of the wife's worldly frustrations. Indeed, the wife's rhetorical question is frustrating, for what is the sense of having a long life in a flesh that will not live that long? So here's some literature about the connection between comedy, poverty, and wealth. For example, Hyman and Hedman and Seidel, they observed that instead of the usual suffering associated with class oppression or domination, there is laughter among the Filipino poor. And Supanchek would ask why laughter prevails in such a situation rather than causing in us something like an existential anxiety. And Marx had already observed that the rich, already living in an abundant life, compel themselves to work hard because they mistakenly judge nature as hostile and stingy, from their definition of economics as a science of scarcity. Now, this is just to illustrate, the Anthropocene's tragic mind, and I'm referencing it from this work by Stephen et al., where they said that the age of Anthropocene has also produced the first generation with widespread knowledge of how our activities influence the Earth system. Their discussion, the Anthropocene, from global change to planetary stewardship, is cluttered with graphs and mathematical models to highlight humanity's knowledge of earthly activities like this. So there's an increasing pressure on the Earth system. And they model it and they converted it into graphs. I'm just showing you this very quickly. And now this is the red zone is the danger, supposedly the danger zone of our planetary or the Earth system, where the loss of biodiversity is supposedly very apparent. Now here is the environmentalist's paradox. There is a high level of well-being in most countries amid erosion of the planetary life support system, that the benefits related to food production outweigh the cost of declines in other services at the global scale. It negates the conventional assumption that food production leads to environmental degradation. So the implication is that while there is environmental degradation and it is costly, it is actually more profitable to continue food production. So how do we now understand the operation of a tragic or a comic mind? So what I did was to come up with a model, and harness the thought of Zygmunt Bauman, Zupanchek, and Kessler. For Zygmunt Bauman, an idea is not an idea unless it produces a paradox or a contradiction, or it points to something uncertain. So an idea is basically a sense that makes sense with nonsense. So for example, when we're hearing something, we're listening to something comical, and we usually say, you know, it's nonsense. So out of that, the comic mind, according to Zupanchek, is that it is already satisfied because it operates on the plane of the nonsense or unknown, and the tragic mind will always be unsatisfied, for it measures all as too much, too little, too late. And in fact, the history or the narrative of the SDG comes from the measurement of the MDG as too much still to do. There's still too much poverty. That's why it became a $1 trillion proposition. And for Kessler, actually, there is a continuum between a scientist and a comic, and the need, no, and the kind of discovery or knowledge that they will eventually arrive at. So, but for comic discovery, it's basically paradox or contradiction exposed. But a scientist, it's because they're operating on the plane of the known or that which makes sense, they're trying to resolve that contradiction. So basically, comic discovery is paradox or contradiction exposed, and scientific discovery is an attempt to resolve that paradox or contradiction, but it can never be resolved because they will always find it too much, too little, or too late. Interestingly, the Anthropocene discourses do not make reference to the sun. And here I'm going to introduce to you the notion of the general economy from Bataille, from his book, The Accursed Share. And we would call it actually also solar economy. And his argument is this: the abundance and wealth of general economy is fueled by the sun, which freely gives and expects no profit in return. He calls it general economy, and he's actually also critiquing the binary between a capitalist economy and a socialist economy. So in this solar economy, for as long as the sun radiates, plant and animals have no choice but to grow and reproduce, and with only a very minimal effort to accomplish it. So for Bataille, we are cursed to live a life of luxury because there's always the production of excess. And the worm of the Bataille's general economy is inhabited by the Buddha's householder, and we might call that householder a worker or an employee who commits acts of deeds like sexual pleasure, procreation, acquisitions of goods, and power. In other words, the householder produces a servile life with spiritual consequences, the rebirth of the same desiring, acquisitive, but servile existence. In this morning's panel, we might call it a consumerist existence, and Buddha would call such a life samsara, or the world of desire and sorrow. And French nuclear physicist Georges Ambrosino, who is actually a friend of Georges Bataille, theorized that the global system produces energy in quantities that surpass our ability to exploit it. There's always excess, and it outshines humanity's ability to produce what will consume such energy. The question is, who then will consume the excess? Before I answer that question, let me tell you a joke. So these are 3 Jewish guys, and they're all entreating God that they were nothing. So the rabbi said, "Oh God, I know I am worthless. I am nothing." The rich businessman said, "Oh God, I am also worthless, obsessed with material wealth. I am nothing." And the poor Jew simply said, "Oh God, I am nothing." And the rich businessman whispers to the rabbi, "What insolence! Who is that guy who dares to claim that he is nothing?" So the wealthy householders who work hard to produce wealth are making the general economy, already abundant to begin with, produce more wealth, more abundance. They need the poor who have nothing, who exist in a situation of scarcity, to consume such excess. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for that very insightful and intriguing presentation, no? And showing us how poverty and wealth, no, can coexist and be mutual to each other using humor, no, as a frame of analysis. And at this point, may we request the tech team to play first the video of Miss Lorna?
Oh yes, thank you so much, tech team. I am so untechy.
This is the story of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past. We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much, tech team. No? So the video really challenges every one of us, no, to have our share, no, in addressing all those issues. And I would like to reiterate the message earlier of Attorney Archel that we really need to push more our advocacy in consuming the things that we only need, no. And I think we can start at the individual level and then going national, regional, and then to global. No? At this point, I would continue the presentation, continue my presentation rather. Okay, let me share my slide first. Okay. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my part, my topic in this panel will be the social development gaps and challenges in marriage migration. So this is actually a part of my dissertation research on the narratives of Filipino women married to South Korean nationals and who are currently residing in South Korea. But in this particular session, I will just focus on the gaps and challenges as well as a glimpse of the social protection policy of South Korea and the Philippines. Marriage migration, by definition, and I think all of you know are already familiar with this, is a collective term referring to cross-border marriages that often involve women migration to their husband's home country. So if we can look at some of the literatures and the statistics, the trends show that most women who migrate come from developing countries, while their husbands to-be are from countries with developed and advanced economies. And inquiry into marriage migration as a subcategory of migration in general is rooted in the study of transnationalism and globalization and their impact on social development, including human rights in general and women's rights in particular. And there are varying entry points into the study of marriage migration depending on the experiences of marriage migrants and the circumstances by which they met their spouses. Though marriage migrants may have similar circumstances, but there are also some unique experiences and diverse experiences ranging from sad stories of violence and abuse to stories of success and empowerment through multicultural integration. Marriage migration is a social development concern. It has economic, political, and socio-cultural implication, but it does not only concern geographic mobility, but also social mobility, such as one's socioeconomic status, lifestyle, quality of life, and well-being. While the decision to marry a foreigner is truly an exercise of women's agency, it is important to note that motivating factors that influence the exercise of such are rooted in the political and socioeconomic conditions of women's country of origin. We all know that migration has both positive and negative impacts, both at the family level and for the larger communities of both houses. Migration is a decision that impacts the welfare and well-being of the household, the home community, and in the end, in the relationship between states. So Philippine-South Korean implies a number of social and legal contradictions that must be closely studied, as this both affect the intimate and personal relationships and also the relationship of two countries. For example, mail order bride schemes are illegal in the Philippines, while these are legal and regulated in South Korea. There are even some local government units in South Korea that provide cash support for South Korean men who choose to engage in mail order bride schemes. So this policy support for marriage migration by the South Korean government is rooted in its social democratic condition, like low birth rates, a discrepancy between Confucian culture and the tradition, and South Korean women's views on marriage and children, and an increasingly aging population. So since the practice is illegal in our country, in the Philippines, many resort to irregular means, which are then associated with trafficking issues and different types of abuses. Another issue is that the Philippine government's program for marriage migrants is limited only to pre-departure orientations. The government does not provide any support interventions for unsuccessful or exploitative marriages. So South Korea, on the other hand, they have a long list of benefits offered to marriage immigrants and their families as part of its multiculturalism policy. Hence, the one critical question that we might ask is, what is the role of the Philippine government in safeguarding the rights and welfare of Filipino marriage migrants? It is ethical not to intervene when the women are already South Korean citizens and receive support from the South Korean government. So those are some of the questions that we might also reflect on. In my study, I covered the narratives of 14 Filipino women married to Korean nationals belonging from different categories. There are those who are married, who met their husbands in South Korea, or some met their husbands in the Philippines. Others were able to meet via the Moonies, or the Unification Church, and those who met their husband through online networks. And there are those who are already professionals like their husband. They reveal the many identities carried by the respondents in terms of age. It reflected their level of maturity, unlike in some other literature where they say that most marriage migrants are younger, they marry at a younger age. In my study, my respondents are already in their mid-20s and working when they met their Korean husbands. They also belong to diverse socioeconomic background and not just like what other literature says, that they are all poor and from the provinces. No, I have respondents from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, and they are a combination of middle and in the middle income, some of them. And then they are proficient in English rather than in Korean. And they are seen in Korea, they are seen as wives, mothers, and tamunwa. Tamunwa is what they call, the term they refer to foreign spouses or families of multicultural families, rather than as individual women. And they are also South Korean and Filipino citizens, but a few did not apply for South Korean citizenship. And they also have formal education, and some or at least attended higher education. There are 4 outstanding factors that motivated these women to marry South Korean nationals. Now, these are the work-related factors, the perseverance of South Korean men in courtship, family-linked migration, and the desire to build an ideal family. The last 3 factors here are not commonly discussed in existing literature. Well, at least none that I encountered up to 2018. No? For the first factor, no, although some of them admitted that their motivation to marry South Korean men is to have opportunity to go and work in South Korea, this did not materialize, no? Because many South Korean husbands and mothers-in-law, as defined by Korean culture and tradition, typically do not allow their wives to work outside of the home. No? So except for those who are already working when they met their South Korean husbands. So many of the respondents are contented with doing part-time jobs. But this does not say that they are genuinely satisfied with performing part-time jobs. And this is just the best deal that they can get after negotiations with their husbands. They would take this compromise rather than not work at all. No? The reproductive responsibilities inside the household are their top priority before they can engage in productive work outside the house. No? In terms of perseverance of South Korean men in literature, as I mentioned earlier, I have never encountered this in my literature. No? The most striking fact for some of these women is the fact that their South Korean husbands defended them from their parents or siblings who were against the relationship. Another salient point that is not fully explored in other literature is the configuration of family-linked migration. Some respondents were able to bring family members to South Korea. One of them even brought all her 6 siblings and therefore has no intention of going back to the Philippines even for a short visit. No? Provision of social services, economic opportunities, and the overall quality of life and well-being are important drivers of family-linked migration. There are also respondents who wanted to build an ideal family and be good wives, no, in order to have a happy life in South Korea. No? Unlike what most literature shows, the victimization of women through marriages by matchmakers, no, I have 2 respondents who were facilitated by Moonies. They said that they don't have any problem with that. Well, by no means, while this does not imply that they did not experience any challenges, but they were able to negotiate with their husbands to ease their financial difficulties. No. Now let's look at the social protection programs in South Korea and the Philippines. No? Social protection as defined by the International Labor Organization is a range of public institutions, norms, and programs aimed at protecting workers and their households from contingency threatening basic living standards. So it has 3 categories: the social insurance, social assistance, and labor market regulation. Social insurance provides protection against life force contingencies such as maternity, old age, of work-related contingencies such as unemployment or sickness. Social assistance provides support for those in poverty and is tax finance, while labor market regulation extends rights to organization and voice. So based on the 2016 Asian Development Bank report on social protection indicators, South Korea spent 7.5% of its 24 million GDP per capita on social protection, while the Philippines only spent 2.6%. South Korea is classified as high-income country, while the Philippines is classified as a lower middle-income country. This is from the 2016 Asian Development Bank report. No? This means that the high-income countries like South Korea, in South Korea, marriage migrants have more access to social protection than in lower middle-income countries like the Philippines. So the data alone shows the difference between the two countries in terms of the amount of resources allocated for social protection, including the social assistance programs. The multicultural policy also stipulates in Korea that marriage immigrants with full-time jobs can also avail of other benefits, such as up to 1 year's worth of paid maternity leave and childcare with assured employment retention. And to encourage this, employers to grant childcare leave to their employees, the government provides employment insurance subsidies amounting to 200,000 won per month per employee during the period of retention, and around 200,000 to 300,000 won per month per substitute worker for the period of replacement. In the Philippines, we also have the RA 11210, which extends paid maternity leave from 60 days to 105 days with additional 15 days if solo parent. South Korea's social protection system is comprehensive and cover all its targets recipients, with a big chunk of its budget allocated to the elderly population. Of course, sustaining an increasingly aging population remains a challenge. Thus, the support system and services provided to multicultural families, including the families of women in this study, are measures made to address the issue. In addition to other measures such as the long-term care insurance and basic old pension for the elderly. The Philippine government, on the other hand, also provides social assistance to its citizens, and one of which is the CCT, the Conditional Cash Transfer, popularly known as the 4Ps. This program provides cash grants to households considered to be the poorest of the poor, provided they meet certain requirements, having children ages 14 years old and below, or pregnant mothers, and beneficiaries must comply with the condition that the school-aged children should attend school, and the pregnant women should have regular prenatal checkups. There is also considerable variation between South Korea's national health insurance system and the Philippines' health insurance system. The NHIS is mandatory under South Korean law. Employees pay 50% of its premium, while the other 50% is paid by employers. For those with no permanent jobs, payment is computed based on information on their household's wealth, including income and property. In the Philippines, PhilHealth is only mandatory for those in the formal economy and optional for the self-employed and for migrant workers. There is a special PhilHealth program for indigent members, where female spouses of families identified by DSWD are automatically enrolled and covered by PhilHealth. However, with regard to the actual benefits that each country's insurance program can provide, PhilHealth can only provide as much as 15,000 pesos in hospital fees, in contrast to South Korean NHIS program, which allows patients to be released without paying anything. South Korea's another distinction is in both governments' policy on solo parents. The South Korean government supports single parents, including marriage migrants divorced from their South Korean husbands, through cash assistance amounting to 600,000 won per month. So it's around 25,000 pesos per child, and a monthly supply of rice. So there is no similar provision in the Philippine Solo Parent Act, which only includes provisions on leave credits, flexible working hours, educational assistance for children, and livelihood skills training. There are some local government units in the Philippines, like Quezon City, which provide solo parents with cash grants for livelihood support, 20% discounts in food establishments, and regular medical assistance. That's why a solo parent of 4 children, like one of my respondents, would really have a difficult life in the Philippines. But since she is in Korea, she's able to provide for her children's needs. So imagine how many, she has like 4 children. So as a solo parent, she's receiving like 600,000 1 times 4. That's how we can compute it. So in South Korea, the government provides free primary and middle schools with the inclusion of free lunch for all students, Anyone can enroll in public schools. Even middle and upper class families send their children to public schools because of the quality of education. At present, both public and private schools receive support from the government, with private schools receiving a smaller subsidy in Korea. In comparison, although the Philippine government also provides free education at the primary, secondary, and most recently at higher education levels, there's no provision for free lunch to all students. Though we have feeding programs in some public schools, but these are just 2 to 3 times a week for selected and usually underweight students. And South Korean daycare facilities and public preschools are also well maintained and operational, unlike in the Philippines, where some of these facilities are often neglected and are hardly functional. Pregnant women in South Korea receive multi-fold support, including free prenatal tests, childbirth preparatory classes and education, free iron pills and folic acid, and medical expense support for pregnant women at high risk. So all pregnant women can avail of free health care from public health centers. Subsidized healthcare insurance also covers maternity health care, including costs for delivery. So in the Philippines, there are health centers where expectant mothers can also avail of these free services, including free provision of ferrous sulfate and tetanus toxoid or HIV screening tests and others. But birth cannot be done in health centers, or at least discouraged. And delivery in public hospitals is also not free. There are also some areas like in this picture, the Women's Center in Jeonji province. It's a women's center providing general health and reproductive health services for all women in Korea. It's like a one-stop shop. Then let's look at the social development gaps and challenges. When talking about social integration, we consider it as the successful transition of one's culture to the host culture, yet preserving their own identity. But if one's understanding of social integration is based on that definition, then one can easily infer that based from the women's narratives, that the South Korean multicultural policy is very much aimed at acculturation or assimilation, and is a one-sided process of adaptation. The provisions for Korean language classes for both mothers and children, in-house Korean language tutors, and orientation and immersion programs on South Korean culture and tradition are all instituted to enable the Tamunwa, or the multicultural family, to better conform with the rules and standards of South Korea. So those married through Munis are even required to undergo a month's training to learn South Korean culture and to learn how to be good South Korean wives. So this training teaches marriage immigrants how to cook Korean dishes, how to set the table correctly, or how to behave and what to do during South Korean holidays and occasions. A training session on learning Korean language is a separate training, which with a specified number of hours, depending on the marriage immigrants' proficiency level. So factors such as citizenship, employment, education, health, housing are important measurements of social integration. The South Korean government provides services and programs to allow marriage immigrants and multicultural families to access these factors. However, the government stops short at ensuring the assimilation and integration of multicultural families, and acts little in terms of educating South Korean society towards acceptance of multicultural families. There are also cases when the foreign wives tolerate to bear the burden of domestic abuse because they have not yet obtained South Korean citizenship. Still, South Korean citizenship does not guarantee foreign spouses full integration into South Korean society, especially given the presence of cultural biases. South Korean culture continues to give value to a homogeneous society, and society still seeks to maintain ethnic homogeneity. Since the country has experienced a low birth rate, the government has encouraged marriage migration, which then resulted in an increasing number of multicultural families. Social acceptability is very crucial for social integration. And in the context of South Korea, it remains one of the biggest challenges that marriage migration continue to face. These women, the women that I interviewed, shared their experiences of being discriminated by South Korean society in a day-to-day engagement. Most encounters are in public setting, in public transportation, in the market or grocery, in media, in schools, and in government. As one respondent said, malalaman mo na lalo na iba ka sa kanila, or you will really feel that you are different, no? Since the programs are women-centered, they send a message that women must be trained and educated to act as real South Korean wives and mothers, no? So there's no guarantee, no, of real social inclusion or acceptance. And sadly, none of my respondents in the study painted a good picture of the Philippine governments, particularly the Philippine embassy in South Korea. None of the respondents found the embassy helpful to them, no? They complained about everything from the lengthy document processing time to the lack of any assistance, no, for them, no? They even shared stories where Filipinos are dying or were deported while the embassy did nothing, no? So it's many respondents feel that Philippine embassy simply takes advantage of them only when there is an event that requires their participation. And finally, though there are similarities in the social protection policies of South Korea and the Philippines, such as those on educational assistance, maternity benefits, and benefits for solo parents, among others, a big difference lies in the budget allocation and the coverage, you know, of benefits. This is primarily because the focus of social protection in developed countries is different from those of developing countries. So for instance, the Philippine social protection programs are focused on poverty reduction, targeting the poorest of the poor. So in South Korea, the focus is on sustaining its level of income and providing adequate living standards for all. Regardless of the amount allocated for social protection, what matters most is the crucial role of institutions in ensuring that implementation of such policies is free from mismanagement and bad governance, no? And regardless of the gaps and challenges, the respondents still prefer to stay in South Korea primarily because of the social assistance programs they receive, no? Though these programs, through these programs, they are able to achieve a quality of life and well-being which they could not have received had they chosen to stay in the Philippines. And that's the end of my presentation. Kansamadda. Thank you po. Now let's proceed with our next, another interesting topic entitled Global Cooperation Against Terrorism in the Age of Anthropocene by Dr. Rommel Banlaoi. Dr. Rommel Banlaoi is the chair of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research and president of the Philippine Society for Intelligence and Security Studies. We will play his presentation, but Dr. Rommel is also here with us to answer some questions later on during our open forum. Tech team, can we play the video of Dr. Rommel?
If you want, just give me a screen share.
Or tech team, can you make Dr. Rommel as co-host so he can share the video presentation? Dr. Rommel, there's no sound.
I'm sorry. Slide before I begin. So the top of my Hi everyone. I would like to thank the Philippine International Studies Organization for the opportunity to participate in this virtual conference. I would like to discuss global cooperation against terrorism in the age of the Anthropocene. So let me share first my slide before I begin.
Can you hear now?
Yes, global cooperation against terrorism in the age of the Anthropocene. And I will follow the following outline in the course of my discussion. I will discuss theoretical and practical importance of terrorism research and counterterrorism studies in the age of the Anthropocene. I will also raise some ontological, empirical, and methodological issues related to the topic, and conclude with a description of the state of literature and global cooperation against terrorism. So terrorism is one of the most horrible human activities of the present time. Horrible because terrorism has the devastating effect not only on humans, but more so on the global environment and the planet Earth. Terrorist activities like wildfires, arson-induced forest fires, that we call pyroterrorism, large-scale bombings, weapons production, and manufacturing and use of improvised explosive devices, among others, are causing carbon dioxide emissions and other environmental damages that immensely harm the Earth's fragile biosphere. This is just one of the environmental impact assessment of terrorism on environmental pollution, focusing on cases of countries that are considered most impacted by acts of terrorism, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Syria, Somalia, Thailand, and Yemen. And based on this study, changes in carbon dioxide emissions are linked with terrorism. In fact, a 1% increase in terrorism gives rise to at least 0.13% increase in carbon dioxide emission. So details of this study can be found in the academic journal. But in the age of the Anthropocene discourse, it is very lamenting to attend that terrorism research and counterterrorism studies have thus far not been given serious scholarly attention. Even in terrorism research and counterterrorism studies, the Anthropocene debate is either lacking or silent, if not utterly absent. This is regrettably frustrating, considering that terrorism is extremely affecting not only human, national, and international security, but also the security of the planet Earth. Take, for example, this study on the environmental impact of war and terrorism, published in 2003 by Dr. Manu. It says that the environmental repercussions of war and terrorism are varied, including bomb damage, altered urban and rural environments, depleted forests, and wildfire cemeteries, museums, and memorials. Despite their poignancy, the destruction of conflict continues today as wars rage in dozens of countries and as the world attempts to combat ever-growing threat of terrorism. So, in the context of these issues, I would like to examine in this presentation the theoretical and practical importance of terrorism research and counterterrorism study in the current scholarly debate surrounding the Anthropocene. I would like to analyze the ontological, epistemological, and methodological implications of the Anthropocene, not only for terrorism research and counterterrorism study, but also more importantly, for counterterrorism policymaking and practice. And my intention is to offer a counterterrorism perspective in international relations analysis of the Anthropocene, not only to advance our existing knowledge on the subject matter, but also to develop a more nuanced policy practice against terrorism that emphasizes the need for a responsible and sustainable global cooperation in the age of the Anthropocene. So let's talk about theoretical issues related with terrorism. Some theories of terrorism and the Anthropocene narrative. And based on orthodox theories of terrorism, according to the study made by Jenny Hocking, when we talk about theories of terrorism, the whole academic discipline is in fact strongly politicized. Yeah. So in this article, Orthodox Theories of Terrorism, the Power of Politicized Terminology. So when we talk about theories of terrorism, it is a highly politicized undertaking. So the saying goes that a theory is for someone and for some purpose. And in the area of the theories of terrorism, it's serving certain political positions or political interests. So it's highly politicized terminology. But according to Martha Crenshaw in his Theories of Terrorism, she identifies the two major approaches to talk about theory of terrorism: instrumental approach and the organizational approach. Instrumental approach is paying greater attention on the role of agents, where terrorism is regarded as the deliberate action of payers. You know, it's a part of its actual intentions to carry out acts of terrorism. It is largely the decision of individuals or players to commit acts of terrorism. But another approach, according to Martha Crenshaw, is the organizational approach, where people engages in acts of terrorism because of the mandate of the organization, where the individual is associated with, or pressures of the organization to commit such acts of terrorism. And for a long, long time, these two theories of terrorism inform our understanding of terrorist threats, particularly before 9/11. But there's another theory of terrorism privileging the identity politics, or the identity theory of terrorism, where acts of terrorism is related with identity politics, either racial identity, national identity, religious identity, or ethnic identity. So it views terrorism from the perspective of identity politics. And just very recently, there is a publication released by Routledge to describe some major theories of terrorism from different academic perspectives. But most of these theories of terrorism are just reaffirming the earlier observations of previous scholars, stating that theories of terrorism can be viewed from a psychological point of view, or from political point of view. So what have we learned from all these theories of terrorism if we will apply the discussion in the current narrative of the Anthropocene? So if you will look at the many theories of terrorism developed through the years, you can see that theories of terrorism remain to be anthropocentric. There is a great privileging of anthropocentrism, focusing on human survival. You know, it reinforces anthropocentrism and undermines biocentrism and ecocentrism in both theories and practice of terrorism. So if we talk about anthropocentrism, as you know already, anthropocentrism is the view or belief that human beings are superior to all other organisms. And this kind of perspective is informing largely existing theories of terrorism. And this runs counter to the narrative in the Anthropocene about the need to pay greater attention to
Dr. Rommel. Dr. Rommel. I think tech team, we have the copy of the video, right? Can we start playing the video?
the identity politics, or the identity theory of terrorism, where acts of terrorism is related with identity politics, either racial identity, national identity, religious identity, or ethnic identity. So it views terrorism from the perspective of identity politics. And just very recently, there is a
publication released by Routledge to describe some major theories of terrorism from different academic perspectives. But most of these theories of terrorism are just reaffirming the earlier observations of previous scholars, stating that theories of terrorism can be viewed from a psychological point of view or from political point of view. Okay. So what have we learned from all these theories of terrorism if we will apply the discussion in the current narrative of the Anthropocene? So if you will look at the many theories of terrorism developed through the years, we can see that the theories of terrorism remain to be anthropocentric. There is a great privileging of anthropocentrism, focusing on human survival. You know, it reinforces anthropocentrism and undermines biocentrism and ecocentrism in both theories and practice of terrorism. So if we talk about anthropocentrism, as you know already, anthropocentrism is the view or belief that human beings are superior to all other organisms. And this kind of perspective is informing largely existing theories of terrorism. And this runs counter to the narrative in the Anthropocene about the need to pay greater attention to biocentrism or ecocentrism. Biocentrism places greater importance on the living components of the environment, while ecocentrism is a perspective that places importance on the whole ecosystem. And it's very lamenting to note in our existing theories and even practice, we see that terrorism studies and counterterrorism practices are in fact largely defined by anthropocentrism. Okay. So what are the ontological issues associated with that? So what is out there to study? What is out there to examine and investigate? So if you will look at the current literature, many of the current literature will talk about cost and consequences of terrorism and counterterrorism. Many of the studies largely focus on human survival, and it's very insensitive and indifferent to the survival of other living beings. So it's not biocentric, and also silent and negligent on the protection of the ecosystem. So it's not ecocentric. And even in the annual Global Terrorism Index report, measuring impact of terrorism, the impact of terrorism is always privileging human survival. Okay? And very little discussion, if there is, on the impact of terrorism on the survival of the planet Earth. So what knowledge can we learn from the things out there? So what are the epistemological issues? So we learned that largely when we talk about theories of terrorism and practice of the counterterrorism, it's largely focused on human survival. As I said, it's anthropocentric, okay? But we still need to develop more perspectives that will pay greater attention on the other living being. So make it more sensitive to a biocentric point of view and also to the whole ecosystem, making our study of terrorism more sensitive to the ecosystem and make it ecocentric. And if you will look at the available methodological approaches to study terrorism and counterterrorism, there are many statistical methods, that can be used, like cost and benefit analysis, which is in fact the most dominant method in studying threats of terrorism. Then we have the SWOT analysis, identifying strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We also have regression analysis, events analysis, time series analysis, systems analysis, and historical analysis, which is also very simple. But based on the study made by Bart Schuurman, when he examined research on terrorism from 2007 to 2016, and also reviewing existing data, methods, and authorship, he observes that in the current literature, there is an over-reliance on secondary sources and associated literature review methodology. Secondary sources, because many sources on terrorism is largely intelligence sources. So many scholars studying the subject matter openly will heavily rely on secondary sources. And he also observed that there is the scarcity of statistical analysis when it comes to the study of terrorism, and a great tendency for authors to work alone rather than collaborate with colleagues. And I'm partly guilty of that. And large numbers of one-time contributors to the field. And I know some of them in the area. But in recent years, we have noticed that the use of primary data has increased considerably and is continuing to do so. And scholars have also begun to adopt a wider variety of data gathering techniques, and greatly diminishing the over-reliance on literature reviews that was noted from the 1980s to the early 2000s. So there are now current changes. But if you will still look at the state of literature, terrorism research and counterterrorism studies have not been given adequate attention in the Anthropocene discourse. Though terrorism research and counterterrorism studies are now increasingly getting notice in international studies, they are still not getting adequate attention in the international relations scholarship on the Anthropocene. So we need more scholars who can bring terrorism research and counterterrorism studies in the international relations or international studies scholarships on the Anthropocene. So if you will look at the current global cooperation against terrorism, the document that is widely being used is the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. And if you will look at the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, is highly anthropocentric, always paying attention to the survival of a human being, and no discussions at all on the survival of the planet Earth. And if you will look at the Global Counterterrorism Forum, only few members are in fact participants to this counterterrorism forum, and their agenda remains to be focused on the survival of the nation state and the impact on human being. And even the former Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation, okay, now called Global Center on Cooperative Security, if you will examine all the reports are largely focused on the need to observe human rights and implement international humanitarian law in counterterrorism measures. So it's largely focused on human being, and no study has been published on the need to protect the environment or to protect the planet Earth in conducting counterterrorism. We have here the Counterterrorism Global Council, which is based in India, and also its research agenda is largely focused on the survival of the human being rather than survival of the planet Earth. So in order to do that, in order to encourage more scholars to do more counterterrorism research that will be sensitive to the security and need of the planet Earth, we need to pursue a counterterrorism perspective international relations analysis of the Anthropocene. And this is what we need right now. So I think with that note, that ends my presentation, and I look forward to the open forum. Good day to everyone. Keep safe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rommel, for that very comprehensive presentation and for challenging us or encouraging us to take serious attention to terrorism research and counterterrorism research. And probably there will be a number of research areas, where we can explore further. And probably our participants later on can make some suggestions on this one. Okay, now we can proceed with our last presentation for this morning. The title of the presentation is Rethinking Food Security Policies in the Philippines, which will be presented by the research team of Mr. Kebart, Licayan, Mr. Billy Balsamo, and Mr. Brian Doce. Mr. Licayan is a lecturer at the Political Science Department of Far Eastern University, Manila, and a part-time lecturer at the International Department Studies of Miriam College. Mr. Balsamo is an undergraduate studying in the School of Law and Governance of the University of Asia and the Pacific. He is currently a Master of Arts in Political Economy with specialization in International Relations and Development candidate at the University of Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Doce is a faculty member of the International Studies Department of the Salle University and the Political Economy Program of the University of Asia and the Pacific. Okay, take it away.
Hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Sorry, let me just set up my camera. Hello. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Billie Jean from the University of Asia in the Pacific, and I will be presenting our research on food security policies in the Philippines. I'm conducting this research with Brian Doce from De La Salle University and Licayan from Far Eastern University. So our main idea revolves around the need to reconceptualize the way we approach food security policies in the Philippines to integrate cultural aspects in indigenous knowledge with a particular attention towards Ilocano frugality. So first, let's talk about the concept of food security. Next. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. It has 4 pillars: availability, access, utilization, which is relevant to the fulfillment of physiological needs, and stability, which is embodied by the phrase at all times in the definition. Next. However, according to Timmer, our current conception of food security is limited in 3 ways. First, paradigms on food policy analysis are anchored on links between poverty and security and measurable indicators such as hunger, poverty, and inflation. As such, any policy proposed or implemented will be reliant on the availability of data. Food security is also influenced by the neoliberal model, especially as food supply in the modern day is controlled by a regime of corporate actors connected by a global chain. This is one way in which the global north influences policies on the global south due to influences of colonialism and prevalent Western conceptions of modernity. Lastly, access to food is defined usually based on the supply side and entitlements. Next. Other criticisms of this definition includes its failure to take into account issues of power and conflicting interests. Causes of food crisis are political and structural. They are not due to factors linked to the invisible hand. The current concept of food security failed to answer questions like how should the food be produced, who shall produce the food, under what conditions must it be produced, for whose benefit, and under whose control. Next. An alternative to food security is food sovereignty, which addresses food security's neoliberal bent and its emphasis on increasing productivity. It has 4 alternative pillars: right to food and food sovereignty, mainstream agroecological family farming, defend people's access to and control of natural resources, and lastly, trade and food sovereignty. However, the problem with food sovereignty is that it's normative and prescriptive, which means it assumes that all societies can achieve food sovereignty by adopting these 4 pillars. It's also materialist in orientation and disregards culture and indigenous knowledge. Next. Next is talk about the food security issues in the Philippines. Next. First issue is government failure. Government intervention in the agricultural sector resulted in market failure. According to David, the increasing protectionism towards the agricultural sector, even after the Philippines' participation in the World Trade Organization, led to increasing prices of agricultural products, which hurt the food security of the large majority of the poor. The Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CARP, also failed to reduce inequality in rural areas. And according to a report by Bayudan Dakoykoy and Bahe, despite efforts from all presidents, from Estrada to the current president, the Philippines still missed its Millennium Development Goals. Next. Next is measurement problems. From the work of Albert and Molano in 2009 on the estimation of the food poverty line in the Philippines, they pointed out difficulties due to scarcity of data and inconsistency of measurements. Typically, the food component of the poverty line is set with the cost of basic needs method, or I think CBN, which entitles determining the price of nutritional benchmark through an artifice. In the Philippines, the official food poverty line is estimated at urban and rural areas to each province by using a one-day food menu as an artifice. Next. Another issue highlighted by Bayudan Takoykoy and Bahe is regional inequality, in which food poverty incidents in different regions differ depending on a variety of factors, which includes armed conflict in regions such as Mimaropa and Bicol, and extreme weather changes also in the Bicol region, which may lead to higher food poverty incidents. Next. Our proposal is to decolonize our understanding of food security policies or food policy formation. The Philippines remains stuck in the Western neoliberal notion of food security, in which the solution is always to try and ramp up production. Next. Usually, this is done through the introduction of imported hybrid crops, which farmers cannot breed into seedlings and keep them reliant on large corporations for the supply. So every crop season, the farmers will have to buy seedlings that supposedly have higher yield, or seedlings that are supposedly more resilient and resilient to pests and extreme weather changes. Next. So why decolonize? According to Makeon, there is a need for a bottom-up food governance approach, a form of micro-resistance in food governance, which revisits our research and knowledge on the aspects of encounter with Western scientific agricultural knowledge for peasant farmers, and creation of popular knowledge rooted in communities and workplaces to empower people directly to act for structural formation. This research is inspired by bottom-up approaches applied in other countries in the Global South. Next. For example, the application of traditional knowledge in food security issues in India by Vixiani and Plahe, who observed that traditional knowledge has been undermined, overwhelmed, or has survived only in fragments. And they described how traditional knowledge might be retrieved, reinvented, reintroduced, and modified so as to create a farmer-driven, sustainable, and biodiverse agriculture. Next. Another is the use of indigenous knowledge systems in Kenya from Songkok, Kiprorir, and Mungalabay to improve food security despite climate change. Here, they observed how IKS can be integrated with scientific knowledge for climate change adaptation. Next. Finally, this research is inspired by the frugality perspective as used by Baduri, Sinha, and Noringa while studying the development of sustainable rural livelihood, or SRL, and grassroots innovation, or GI, in Africa. They argued that the frugality perspective allowed for cross-sectorality in the development of food security policies. Next. This framework highlights three characteristics of a frugal way of decision-making. As first, search process using simple hierarchical steps and intuitive reasoning rather than fixed rules such as optimization, efforts to adapt to the environment challenges through demonstrated capacity for learning and imitation, and an emphasis on actual performance, practicability, and effectiveness rather than on logical or scientific validation. Next. Our team aims to use a similar framework with Ilocano frugality. Next. In the process, we aim to answer several questions such as, what are the expressions of frugality that makes it distinctly Ilocano? How can these expressions be operationalized in food security policies? And is there a significant overlap between Ilocano frugality and other expressions of Filipino frugality that will allow policies based on Ilocano frugality to be used on a larger national scale? We would like to emphasize on the potential of this paper to disrupt the universality in food security and promote agency of countries in the Global South. We are not just victims of the Anthropocene. We have means of addressing its problems. We only need to cultivate them. So this is a working paper, and we appreciate your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very informative presentation, and for sending us a message that food insecurity, is one of the root causes of poverty that is also linked with the other issues of environment, economy, and social issues. And for providing us some strategies, specific strategies to address this issue, like the bottom-up approach, the indigenous knowledge system, and also specifically promoting the use of frugality perspective in decision making. So at this point, I would like again to thank all the presenters. We are now opening the virtual floor for some questions or comments. You can raise your hand or you can type the questions in the chat box. Or if you want to add additional information about any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat box any comments or questions. Yes, we have a question from Dahlia. Yes, you can unmute your. Yes, Dahlia. Sorry, unmute. Yes, Dahlia. You have a question from Dahlia. Yes, please unmute.
All right. Okay. Thank you for the excellent presentations. I really like all the presentations, but Dr. Banlaoi, Sir Rommel's presentation is closer to when it comes to peace building. Post-conflict peace building is also very still human-centric. There's a need for better integration of environmental considerations and even ecological considerations. And this is not my only observation. Several scholars also have observed that even though the name environment is in that environmental peace building agenda, still the objectives are still quite human-centric, with a focus on human considerations. And I think Sir Rommel's presentation, if this is a full paper, I think it will be a great contribution to the Anthropocene discourse, specifically on security. I think it terrorism and counterterrorism. And I noted what you said a while ago about the lack of primary data. If we have this research agenda on counterterrorism that integrates more ecological considerations, then I think that and maybe we can start with the Philippines, right? Sir Rommel, you've done a lot of work on the Philippines and also in the region. Maybe start such a research agenda, such research framework can guide collecting data from the though focus more on cooperation. You've mentioned cooperation and sustainability. I'm asking this because much on the field, a lot of the publication it's still emphasizing this conflict and environmental degradation, but I think we need more emphasis on cooperation instead. So cooperation rather than conflict, and sustainability rather than that you are proposing in your presentation will take the same line or the same approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Dahlia, for that comment. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with my internet right now, so I'm not sure if I was able to capture all your your comments. No, but I think Dr. Rommel, Dahlia would like to ask if you have if this is a full paper, no, that you can share with all of us, probably, so that we can be more more encouraged, no, to look into the research on terrorism and counterterrorism. And I think she also would like to know more about the cooperation, or the emphasis on cooperation and sustainability. No? So, Dr. Rommel.
Yes, thank you very much, Dahlia, for your very useful comments. Yes, I am. I will exert my best effort to finish my full paper and hopefully publish it in a reputable journal. And I will recommend you to be one of my reviewers if that happens. But you know, Dahlia, this is also part of my advocacy, having been studying terrorism and counterterrorism, particularly in Southeast Asia. I want to focus my future research now on global counterterrorism cooperation that emphasizes less military actions, less police actions, and privileging more civil society response and the radicalization, counter-radicalization, more economic, political, social interventions rather than military actions and police operations. So in the existing global cooperation against terrorism and even in the existing capacity building, largely focused on building the capacity of the police, building the capacity of the military, but less on the capacity of the communities to respond to terrorism or to the private sector to respond to the terrorism. In fact, next week, I'll be delivering a keynote speech also in an international conference organized by the Philippine Society for Industrial Security, where I will emphasize this need to really realign our capacity building more on building the capacity of community, building the capacity of citizenry in the global campaign against terrorism. So more political, economic, social, religious intervention. Kasi saturated na. We have so much capacity building on military and police and even intelligence, but less on capacity of communities. But at the same time also introducing our current debate now on the Anthropocene, global cooperation against terrorism, where the counter-terrorism measures will be more sensitive on environment. Like for example, you know, combating terrorism. You train military officers to kill and bomb and use drones at the expense of the environment and at the expense of other living things. Dahlia, if you're interested to do research, how many living things died during the global campaign against terrorism, global campaign against terrorism in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan? You know, how many cattle died? And right now, you know, even followers of the Islamic State now toying the idea of using animals as carrier of improvised explosive device. Imagine, well, for me, it's really a disservice to the other living things that you use other living things as carrier of improvised explosive device. So that's it. And I have this very ambitious project also, Dahlia, that in my current conversation with terrorist leaders, because of course even the intelligence community knows that I have access to them, that I'm telling them that yeah, if you really want to use acts of terrorism because you consider yourself as freedom fighters, at least don't harm the environment. Don't harm the other living things, you know, just harm your combatants. You know, so can we develop a sort of international humanitarian law for other living things? Because the international humanitarian law only protects individuals, right? But do we have some sort of international humanitarian law to protect the living things and the environment during combat operations. That's all. I think I'm thinking too far. But yeah, Dalia, I hope I will finish my full paper and contribute to the existing literature like what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banlaoi. Any other question or comments? I think while the others are still thinking, I would like to also pose a question to the presentation of the research team of Mr. Licayan. And how do you think, how specifically can you use or can we apply the frugality perspective in the context of the Philippines? No? Anyone po from Mr. Licayan, Mr. Balsamo, and Mr. Doce? How can we?
Hello. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. When it comes to the application of frugality in the Philippines, I think it depends on which expression of Filipino frugality that we want to look at. Like for example, for our particular research, we wanted to focus on the idea of Ilocano frugality, mainly because of the stereotype regarding Ilocanos in the Philippines that, oh, if you're Ilocano, kuripot ka, right? And to which their response is always, hindi kami kuripot, masinop lang. Or in English, we're not misers, we're just more prudent. And with our interaction with members of this ethnic community, we realized that like a lot of the conceptions of frugality in Ilocano is usually tied with this idea of the tagkiriwe, or the period in which the community experiences the most poverty, which we believe is tied to the seasonality of agriculture in the Philippines. So from the perspective of Ilocano frugality, it's really about the household economy, but we want to analyze it in the sense that we can apply it to the food security of the Philippines due to its connection with the seasonality of agriculture and agricultural communities. So admittedly we need more data regarding the expressions of Ilocano frugality in the Philippines. But Sir Keb would like to add something.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, sorry, I'm currently on my way. My
Yes,
province.
Kev. Yeah, we can hear you.
Apologies for this one. But yeah, in terms of frugality, we actually have a government policies related to frugality. I think that's called austerity program. But I think with the implementation of the austerity program, there are a lot of failures with the implementation. So I think we may look at it first and then rethink and reevaluate what makes this austerity program not really working well. So I think from there we can start having that kind of conversation and and really look at analyze how we can integrate more the different concepts of Filipino frugality and make it be part of the policy making. I think in the policy making, the Philippines is really the future that has not been really been given attention. So we are always looking at the new liberal approach of doing policy making. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Keb. Yes. I think do you have questions from the other participants? Lawrence, question for Miss Lorna. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, question for Miss Lorna. Yes. Do you think when we use the humor as the frame of analysis in showing how we look into poverty issue, is somehow sending a message that we are being hopeless, or it's somehow on a negative perspective that we're not there's nothing we can do, so let's just laugh about it? So what can you say about that? Is it something negative? Can we see it as something negative?
Okay, hi. Thank you for that question. No, it's not something negative or positive. Humor or laughter actually points to the limits of what can we know. And as researchers, there is also an advocacy among those who are looking at contradictions or paradoxes in our everyday life that we need to be alerted or we need to be conscious of these contradictions. So it's basically, it's telling us that there is something that may not yet be known, no, in our lifetime, and we just have to accept it. So it's not a matter of, you know, it's being negative or being positive. And on that note, no, maybe when we are concerned with, or when we are alerted to contradictions, then we might be, one, more careful about our analysis. Two, we might be kinder to our fellow human being. And three, it might give birth to another branch of knowledge. So for example, there's now a divide between the classical physics and theoretical physics. Einstein got so upset that his colleagues, when they reported to him, sir, we cannot measure the planetary system and all of the energies and constellations there. And Einstein said, no, that cannot be, that's impossible. So it gave birth, no, to the theoretical physics. And the theoretical physicists, no, would say that there are limits to what we can know, and we must accept and respect that limits. That's why the comic mind operates on the level of the unknown, and we must not be afraid of it. And as opposed to the tragic mind, it's scared. We must end this. No, we must resolve it. So basically, that's what the comic mind is telling us. There are limits to what we can know at some point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lorna, for that. And I think I don't see any more questions in the chat box or any private message sending to me. And I think that's an indication that we are all hungry, and I don't want to violate your right to food as well. Yes. And I just want to read the comment first by Attorney Archil, that between alarmists and the comic mind, I'd go for the latter any time of the day. Thank you so much for attending our panel for this morning. It's basically sharing with us, you know, some of the issues that we also have to look into from the perspective of poverty, from the issue of poverty to migration, to terrorism and food insecurity. We are all being challenged that we need also to do our piece, no, be it individual or to policy level, no. Again, thank you very much, and please don't forget to come back at 1:30. We still have several panels, no, for this afternoon. Thank you again. And thank you to all the tech team and the rest of the presenters.